For those of you joining us now, welcome to the second Herbert Smith Freehills Disability Mooting Championship, Oxford and Cambridge, though this will very much be the first time we've done this event entirely online. And I'm hugely grateful to Sakela and the other members of our student organising committee who've done an absolutely superb job in organising this event today. I'm also grateful to the Herbert Smith Freehills and particularly their disability network members, Daniel Hudson and Tim Lever, who have been great supporters of the work that we do here in Oxford and this event in particular. I'm Dr. Marie Tidball. I am chair of the organising committee for this event and director of the Oxford University Disability Law and Policy Project. This is an event that we're really proud of. We've been running now since 2014, and the event aims to promote the discussions of the ways in which issues affecting people with disabilities intersect with the law. So it's my now great pleasure to pass back over to my colleague, Sakela.
Hello, I'm Sakela. I'm the president of the student committee for the Moot today and a law student at Oxford. The panel today will be chaired by Professor Tom Shakespeare, who trained at Cambridge and is now a professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. In this panel, the panelists will be discussing the right to health, asking whether the COVID-19 pandemic has called into question the right to health equality and access to adequate healthcare for disabled people in the UK. You should all have access to a pack with information on the issues at hand and links to further information. Please use the Q&A panel in Zoom to send questions you have for our panelists so that they can answer them during the Q&A portion of the discussion. And remember to pin the British Sign Language interpreters, Mary Oxenham Hall and Josie Binfield, if you need their services, and that Otter AI is being used throughout the session. I'd now like to hand over to Professor Tom Shakespeare to kick things off.
Thank you very much indeed, Sakela, and thank you all for being here tonight. This is a great privilege. It's a great privilege to welcome the panel of Jane Campbell, Baroness Campbell of Surbiton, Steve Broach and Kush Kanodia, and I'm going to introduce them in turn. I've been asked to say a few words about the COVID-19 pandemic and how it affects disabled people. We're doing a study funded by the government of the impacts, and we're going to be publishing a paper later, early in 2021. We've had some really interesting interviews in England and Scotland. I think that the pandemic affects people at different levels. It affects them, as it were, in a medical level, but also in a social and perhaps even a cultural level too. We know that if you look at who has died, sadly, from COVID-19 in this country, they have been disproportionately older people. So if you look at the graph, most of them have been 80, 70 to 79, 60 to 69, and then it falls off in the 50 to 59, and it's much, much smaller below 50. And of course, we remember that 1 in 3 disabled people are aged over 60. And so it would not be, about half of all disabled people are over 60. So it would not be surprising that many disabled people were among those who died. Secondly, we know that COVID-19 is trivial for many people, but if you have comorbidities, if you have cardiovascular problems, diabetes, respiratory disease, or high blood pressure, hypertension, you are at particular risk of having a really serious bout of COVID-19, perhaps even dying. And disabled people are known to be at higher risk of those conditions. And that explains why, if we look at the data from the Office of National Statistics, 59% of all COVID-19 deaths were disabled people. And just to put this into perspective, 16% of the population are disabled, but 59% of deaths. And of course, given that older people are particularly at risk, I think that's a large part of it. And in that period of time, the ONS data was recently published from the 2nd of March to 14th of July, more than 12,000 males with disability over 65 and more than 13,000 women with disability over 65 died. Now, if you look at the group under 64, then it looks really, really bad, because 38.5% of all male deaths from COVID of that group under 64 were disabled. And 67% of the total number of women who died under the age of 64 were disabled. So that's really, really extreme, because most people under the age of 65, thankfully, don't die. Whereas sadly, as you get older, you're more likely to die. However, the absolute numbers of people with disabilities under age 64 is much, much, much lower who sadly die of COVID. So something like just over 1,000 men and 800 women in that period from March to July who died were disabled people who we mourn and we're very sad about. But remembering something like 2,000 people under 64, but something like 25,000 people over 64 in that period who had disabilities. We've just had some really shocking data from LIDA, which is the Census of Deaths among adults with learning disabilities. And it showed that 79% of the deaths that they studied 206 recent deaths of adults with learning disabilities, 79% of them resulted from COVID-19. And that's really shocking. 79% of all of the deaths that were reported, that were analysed by LIDA, were attributable to COVID-19 out of those 206 cases. And why was this? Well, a third of these folk, 35%, lived in residential care settings and 25% lived in supported living. So these are people in care situations. These are people who are being supported by care workers and who are living very closely with other folk who are also being supported and perhaps having visitors. And we know that in social care, there's been a really extreme lack of PPE. All of the research we've done finds that disabled people's organisations and care agencies lack enough PPE for their care workers and personal assistants. So half of those 206 deaths were because of contagion from care workers or other residents. So that's really extreme. And we also know that people with learning disabilities who died from COVID were 50% more likely to be overweight, obese, have high blood pressure, 72% had pre-existing respiratory conditions. And we know that many people with intellectual disability have lower levels of immunity. So what we have there is a combination of a biological issue and a social issue. The social issues through PPE and residential situation, coupled with an underlying risk. But why are people with learning disabilities having lower health, having a high blood pressure, and being obese? Well, that's social as well. So we've got something to deal with, something very, very important to deal with as we go on. I just want to make one more point, which is that we are all stressed with this pandemic. It is difficult not seeing people, your friends, your family. It's difficult being isolated. There was a study which found that more than half of all Americans felt that the coronavirus epidemic had had a negative impact on their mental health. And returning to the British Office of National Statistics, almost 1 in 5 adults were likely to be experiencing some form of depression during the coronavirus pandemic in June. And that had doubled. Prior to the pandemic, it was 1 in 10 who were experiencing some form of depression. By June, 1 in 5, which is a really extraordinary increase. And if we think about poverty, isolation, if they're worried about being seen as vulnerable, they're reliant on others, all of these mechanisms, the grief and loss that seeing people die, mean that people are perhaps more likely to have lower mental health, lower well-being, more depression as a result of this terrible pandemic. So it's not just the disease, it's our reactions to the disease. It's a combination of these things, which makes life very difficult for many disabled people in Britain and throughout the world at this time. So those are my remarks to set us up. I want now to hand over to somebody who I have immense respect for, with all disabled people in Britain. Jane Campbell, Baroness Campbell of Surbiton, is a crossbencher in the House of Lords. But prior to that, she was Disability Rights Commissioner. After that, she was a Commissioner of the Equality and Human Rights Commission. She was former chair of the Social Care Institute of Excellence. She co-founded the National Centre for Independent Living. She was co-chair of British Council of Disabled People. She's a founding member of Not Dead Yet in the UK. So absolutely pivotal to the British disability movement, and that's why we hold her in such great prestige and renown. She's got honorary degrees, she's been appointed to this, that, and the other, rightly, and it's a great honour to introduce Jane. So Jane, over to you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for that introduction. Really, I'm just an all-round bossy boots, and so that's why I'm around and pretty visible in areas where people need to be organised and sorted. That's what I like to do in life. So thank you for that. Tom, you've given a very good introduction for me to setting the scene and looking at some of the numbers and the evidence that we've been receiving this year about how disabled people were affected by this pandemic. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state response to those figures, and also I hope to talk a little bit about how disabled people actually they have come through with great resilience during this time, and it's not all a story of doom and gloom, because there have been some great moments of hope and whereby disabled people have come together to solve their own problems when the state was obviously failing them. So the evidence that Tom has so clearly given to us this evening suggests that, yes, there were some incredible failings in terms of disabled people's support and life-saving treatment during this pandemic. In early April, the UN High Commission was putting out some incredibly clear warnings to all European states that people with disabilities not only face greater risks from COVID-19, but they were also going to be disproportionately affected by response measures, including the lockdown. And so the UN High Commissioner called for targeted measures to be addressed, and she issued a set of guidance notes to all states to that purpose. What happened in the UK? Well, I'm afraid this guidance was ignored, and it did not make its way into the guidance that was produced by the British government as they were developing it throughout the pandemic. And even though disabled people and their organisations had produced by the beginning of May very clear priority lists for their own survival requirements, this again was ignored by the government. And being inside Westminster, I can tell you it was incredibly difficult holding the government to account during this time on disability planning and responses to different disabled people's needs throughout the pandemic. So if we look at the top 5 priorities for disabled people during the pandemic, definitely from March, it was sourcing food from supermarkets, asking for priority delivery slots over others as a legal, reasonable adjustment under the Equality Act. The second priority was accessing vital PPE, especially for the care and support staff who were being employed by disabled people privately. there are over 270,000 disabled people to employ PAs at this time in the home. And I can tell you that we were not on a priority list for PPE. And that's 270,000 people employed under direct payments. That's known, a known figure, a government figure. I think there are a lot more. The third priority was assurance of equal access to healthcare and not being subjected to GPs ringing them up, asking them whether they can put a DNR notice on their medical records, so that should they go into hospital, it would be known that this is what would be seen as reasonable in terms of if one got COVID-19. There were 6 cases of GPs phoning up disabled people within the first week, asking this question, as it required a Department of Health notice to go out to say that actually all lives mattered and there should be no blanket policies of DNR or triage. There should be no blanket policies that meant that disabled people with underlying conditions would not go to intensive care. But again, this requires a very high level notification that only happened because we were able to make that clear to them. The fourth priority was accessible information. There was quite a campaign during May and June around the 5 o'clock government briefings from deaf people, because there was no sign language interpreter. So access to information, government information as to what the public should do, was going out without a sign language interpreter. And the comeback to that was that subtitles could be used and that sign language interpreter would be used on News 24. But this was not allowing everybody equal access to the same information at the same time. And the fifth priority was campaigning for a dedicated contingency list of volunteers able to support disabled people whose carers or support workers could not come. We have many situations of disabled people who were left without a single PA because somebody had contracted the virus and everybody then had to go into isolation. So the lack of support for people within the community to employ their own staff was unknown, unthought about, and not responded to. So instead of response, well, they decided the Coronavirus Act, which was brought into force in March, it brought about a set of provisions which served to decrease disabled people's ability to live independently and survive the pandemic due to these things called easement powers. And the easement powers basically gave local authorities flexibility, allowing them to reprioritise disabled people's care and support provision to meet the needs of the pandemic. In reality, it meant that vital care and support was reduced and, in some instances, cut altogether, leaving disabled people even more at risk and vulnerable in the community. So, in winding sort of up, although the vulnerable, as the government put it, were told that we were shielded and put on a list for guidance, when it arrived, we had absolutely no means to follow it. The vulnerability conceptualization, I felt, became a static, meaningless concept, which simply served to anonymise our humanity and our human rights. We became a passive victim instead of an involved citizen. And if we'd been involved in the solutions to our own issues, maybe things would have been very differently. So for many, the risks increased. And during the 5 worst months of the pandemic, the UK government breached the rights of disabled people in at least 70 different ways. And although half of these have now been addressed due to active campaigning by disabled people, many are still waiting to be tackled. So I think it was a grim time. The most heartening part of all of it was the proliferation of networks across social media that were set up by disabled people to basically help one another through the period. And it served as a very good way to glean information and data and ideas to take to those within NHS England, NHS Improvement, within I Ask Questions. And without those networks, I couldn't possibly have managed to have held government to account in the way that I did. Now, that's kind of a very quick cobbling together of some of the issues that disabled people faced at the time. But what I would like to say is that because of disabled people, because of their resilience, because we have a history of campaigning and organising, we were able to probably cope a lot better than we might have been able to without that body of active disability culture that we have developed over the last 25 years. And then thank God for that, because it was a very, very hard time. It still is. There are many things I could tell you about that would horrify those working in the area of equality and human rights. But yeah.
We come back. Well, let's come back to that in the questions, because I think people will have loads of questions for you, and you've got more to say.
Yeah. So back to you, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was so powerful and incisive and relevant. Thank you very, very much. We know that what Jane said about the Coronavirus Act overruling the Care Act is so important. Thousands, literally thousands and thousands of social care contracts were cancelled. We have evidence of that from both England and Scotland by local authorities because of the onset of the pandemic and the fact that they didn't have to deliver those services anymore. I'm going to pass now to Steve Broach. Steve is a barrister who specialises in disability rights cases. He's at 39 Essex Chambers. He's been involved in a number of Supreme Court cases involving disabled people. Really relevantly, importantly, he was involved in the successful challenge to the NICE guidelines on treatment prioritization, which initially incorporated a frailty scale, which he might say more about, but basically would have made many disabled people seen as frail, when actually they were living very full lives and it wasn't relevant at all. His background, he's been working at the National Autistic Society, the Council for Disabled Children. He's an author of a leading text about disabled children, so he's supremely well qualified to speak. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Tom. I was reflecting as we were getting ready for this talk that there's only one thing that's more daunting than speaking after Baroness Campbell, and that's speaking after Professor Shakespeare and Baroness Campbell. So I'll do my best to add something to the fantastic contributions that we've already heard. And I think I'm going to grapple and cling on to the fact that I've got a lawyer's perspective to add, which is a narrow perspective, but I think a useful one in the context of this debate. And I was very much echo what Baroness Campbell said about the importance of networks. I think one of the striking upsides, if you can call it that, of the last few months has been how effectively social media allows disabled people and allies to network, and how disabled people have been able to access lawyers and legal advice, not all the time, far from it, but at least some of the time. And the example that Tom gave of the challenge to the NICE guidelines that I'll come back to is a really good example of that. So there has been some effective use of the law during the pandemic, both behind the scenes and in lobbying terms, but also front and center in actual or proposed litigation as well. So the question, of course, that we've been asked to talk about is whether the pandemic has eroded the right to health equality and access to adequate healthcare for disabled people. And my short answer to that is not in theory, but most definitely in practice. Because actually, if we take the Coronavirus Act as the most striking example, what the Act actually did in law was relatively modest. It suspended the continuing healthcare assessment process, which is obviously very problematic for disabled people with complex health needs. It eased, as Baroness Campbell and Professor Shakespeare both mentioned, the Care Act and removed enforceable duties, but with a very significant caveat, which was that the department's statutory guidance that was issued under the Coronavirus Act told local authorities not to use the easements, and if they were going to use them, they had to go through a very strict process involving sign-off by senior officers and councillors, and publicly state that they had moved to that level where they were no longer able to comply with the Care Act duties. And only a handful of local authorities ever actually did that. I think the running total reached 10 at one point, and it's now back to 0. So as of now, and I think since the summer, the legal position is that no local authority is stating publicly that it's unable to comply with its Care Act duties, and therefore they all should be complying with them in full. But the reality, as Professor Shakespeare has made clear, is that loads and loads of disabled people lost their social care as a result of the pandemic. And it's the gap, I think, between the law as it is and what people assume it must be that's really problematic here, and the need to share information and make sure that, as Baroness Campbell said, access to accurate information, accessible information for all disabled people about what they're actually entitled to is vital to avoid misinformation and breaches, systemic breaches of disabled people's rights. Because what's also striking, I think, under the Coronavirus Act is that it didn't touch the Equality Act and it didn't touch the Human Rights Act. And it's those two twin pieces of legislation, I suggest, are the bedrock of disabled people's rights, right, including the right to healthcare. So the Equality Act, of course, premised on the principle of equal treatment, but also including the vital duty to make reasonable adjustments for disabled people, including in the access to the healthcare that they need, which was why it was just so shocking to hear of this misuse of do not resuscitate notices and the way in which, in reality again, disabled people were being given less good access to healthcare as opposed to more accessible and adjusted access to healthcare. So the Equality Act has always remained, and the Human Rights Act has remained. And of course, anyone who knows anything about human rights law will know that there's this ongoing tension about how far the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act that gives effect to it can be made into an instrument that protects people's social rights and rights, for example, to healthcare. But what it does guarantee, first of all, is minimum standards and the avoidance of inhuman and degrading treatment and disproportionate interferences with people's private life, including their physical and psychological integrity, their well-being. But it also provides another guarantee of equal treatment, Article 14 of the Convention, making clear there can be no discrimination in the way that people enjoy their human rights. So the legal underpinnings didn't go, but what I think collapsed was a sense of obligation to follow those underpinnings. It was as if the virus somehow trumped the law, which it never did, at least in theory, but may well have done in practice. So just to mention the specific issue that Tom flagged in the introduction, there was right at the beginning, I think in March, one of the things that I felt as a lawyer was that I was running around constantly on behalf of a range of different clients saying So government and non-governmental bodies, you've effectively forgotten about disabled people. But in the panic that there was in February and March, you've just not thought about what this means for my clients, for disabled people. And that's certainly how it felt with the NICE guidelines on critical care, because what happened there, as Tom's mentioned, is that the guidelines effectively incorporated a tool, a clinical frailty scale, which was not designed for use on working age adults. It was designed for use in relation to the population of the elderly, if you'll forgive me as a shorthand, and was completely inappropriate to be translated, or not even translated, just applied across to working age adults, and would have meant that a very large number of disabled people would have been assessed at level 5 or above, which would have meant that they were not deemed to be appropriate necessarily for hospital treatment. And there would have been an encouragement to discuss do not resuscitate notices with them. And unsurprisingly, I'm pleased to say that when it was flagged up to NICE, that the potential risk of this was that lots and lots of younger disabled adults would be denied hospital treatment in a way that would be, I'd suggest, obviously discriminatory and unlawful. The guidance was then changed. But again, on my theme of law and reality, how much damage had it already done? How many decisions were already being made on that kind of basis, that it was permissible to give disabled people less good healthcare in the pandemic? And there was a guidance document that came out with the NHS logo on it that again incorporated those kinds of approaches, which was then disowned by all relevant bodies. But again, how much damage did that do as it circulated through the health community? So there's a real problem with rearguard action, the law being used as a rearguard action to try and stop and tackle potentially unlawful and discriminatory policies, rather than government thinking about these issues of non-discrimination and human rights in the first place to avoid the detriment being caused at all. In terms of where we are now, just to flag two quick issues, legal issues that I think are really significant, and they go from some of the most fundamental human rights, the right to life, of course, in terms of treatment prioritization in the event that the second wave of the pandemic were to overwhelm health services, and the NHS was in a position that it's never been in, of having to ration access to critical care. There is currently no national guidance as to how that should be done. And from a disability rights perspective, I find that deeply concerning, because it will mean that local trusts will have to make individual decisions as to how they choose to prioritize essentially beds, critical care beds, without a framework to make those incredibly difficult decisions in the unhappy event that we end up in that space, which thankfully we didn't in the first wave, but by some accounts, it got pretty close. On the other end of the spectrum, in terms of this idea of human rights being about the small places close to home, where people are incredibly intimate and connected to each other, issues around visiting and access across a whole range of settings, care homes, but also people's own homes, supported living providers, and so on, putting in place blanket policies and rules that restrict family members, loved ones, friends from seeing disabled people during the pandemic. And although it's helpful that the government guidance says there shouldn't be blanket rules, no visiting, what the current care home guidance says is it's really up to local areas again. And I'm very aware that a number of local areas do effectively have blanket no visiting policies. I'd suggest that's unlawful, but it's happening again in large parts of the country. And the situation in relation to supported living settings is even less clear, because the guidance is only for care homes. So real concerns again, that although if you look at the current set of lockdown regulations, the number 4 coronavirus regulations, there are several ways in which they've taken disabled people's needs into account that wasn't the case originally, and I can perhaps expand on that in questions. There are still massive concerns about, as James rightly said, I'm sure, disability issues not being front and center in decision makers' minds when these policies are being set, and the law having to act as a safety net after the event, when quite a lot of the damage has already been done. And that's not how we want to see it, and that's not what the vision was for the Equality Act, for example. And before that, of course, the Disability Discrimination Act 25 years ago, in terms of embedding, changing cultures and making sure that disability rights was everyone's priority.
Thank you, Steve. That is so helpful and absolutely relevant and worrying in many ways. So thank you for all the work you do, as with Jane, to support and uphold the rights of disabled people. So last but very much not least, we come to Kush. Kush Kanodia is Chief Disability Officer at Kaleidoscope Group. He's a social entrepreneur. You saw him carrying a torch on his photo there at the Paralympic Games in London 2012. He has been recognized as a leader in technology, as an Asian achiever, and of course in the Disability Power List. But more important than all of that is his campaigning. He's campaigned to stop disabled car parking charges in NHS hospitals. Thank you very much, Kush. And he's currently campaigning on disability parking policy generally across the UK. So very important to be on the ground in the community and making a difference. So over to you, Kush. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Tom. It's a real honor to be here. I'm going to re-emphasize some of the points that have already been stated so eloquently by my esteemed panelists. And I wanted to wish everyone a very happy Diwali on this very auspicious day today. The last 10 years of austerity and the UK government's welfare reform has led to grave and systematic violations of disabled people's rights in the UK. These are not my words, but that of the UN Committee of the Rights of Disabled People. These were the findings in 2015, when the UK became the first member state to be investigated for violations of disabled people's rights. Unfortunately, the Coronavirus Act 2010 has continued this unprecedented assault upon disabled people's human rights, suspending key protections in the Care Act and the Children's and Family Act. The Coronavirus Act has therefore undermined and diminished the right to care for disabled people. And this was even disgracefully voted in again at their 6-monthly review on the 30th of September, despite over 150 organizations calling on the government to remove the powers in the Act that are in direct breach of the UK's obligations under the UN Convention of the Rights of Disabled People. The COVID-19 pandemic has therefore exposed, magnified, and compounded the deep-seated structural inequalities, exploitations, and discriminations that disabled people experience in the UK. The lack of value of disabled people's lives is perhaps most clearly demonstrated when people with learning disabilities and autism were labeled "do not resuscitate" with little or no consultation. Recently, a report from Public Health England revealed that people with learning disabilities who were aged between 18 and 34 were 30 times more likely to die with the virus than their non-disabled counterparts. This could be partly due to the lack of easy read guidance and even BSL at government COVID-19 press conferences, even though the UK government has legal duties to produce accessible information. An online survey conducted by BBC News and YouGov provides the shocking results that 71% of disabled people believe their lives have been negatively affected during the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus was seeded into care homes when the elderly and disabled patients were discharged to make space in NHS hospitals without actually being tested for the COVID-19 pandemic. Though additional capacity was created with NHS Nightingale hospitals, these facilities essentially lay dormant while critical, urgent and emergency care services were ring-fenced for COVID-19 patients. ONS research on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic in Great Britain highlights that disabled people have been disproportionately affected by reductions and cancellations to NHS treatment. The impact is perhaps best summed up by Inclusion London's Abandoned, Forgotten and Ignored report, finding disabled people are experiencing increasing levels of psychological distress, social isolation, lack of social care support, workplace discrimination, food poverty, and unequal access to healthcare. The compounded impact of all these may be the reason the Office of National Statistics has also discovered that 3 out of 5 of all COVID-19 deaths have been disabled people, even though they state disabled people only amount to 16% of the population. Whilst this is a shocking statistic, what was equally shocking was the lack of media coverage on the disproportionate impact of disabled people. The Bank of England's chief economist has recently warned the COVID-19 crash will likely make inequality worse, and we could see the opposite of leveling up, stating that it was a priority before and it's an absolute necessity now. The Social Metrics Commission report measuring poverty had previously found disability as one of the strongest predictors of being in poverty. So what can the government do? Here are 5 of my recommendations. 1, implement the No Wheelchair Tax campaign to abolish all NHS disabled car parking charges. The current government has delayed implementation of their manifesto commitment to abolish all NHS car parking charges for those most in need from April 2020 to January 2021. However, the government has still not provided NHS hospitals with policy guidance and therefore must be planning on delaying this again. My recommendation would be therefore to implement the free disabled parking element of the manifesto for January 2021. This will help to level up and save disabled people's lives in a pandemic. 2, creation of a standardized and compassionate disabled parking policy in the UK. This has already been implemented in September 2010 by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, expanding free disabled parking from 1 hour to 4 hours, matching statutory target waiting times for A&E, enabling street access to 3 of the leading hospitals in the UK: Chelsea, Westminster, the Royal Brompton and the Royal Marsden. So far, I have not received favourable responses from the other inner London boroughs that have exemptions from the National Blue Badge Scheme: City of London, Westminster and Camden. This policy initiative needs to be implemented into law as part of the duty of reasonable adjustment to disabled people under the public sector equality duty for all councils. 3, we urgently need a national disability strategy co-produced with disabled people that incorporates the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People into British law. This means eliminating disability discrimination, enabling disabled people to live independently in the community, ensuring an inclusive education system, and that disabled people are protected from all forms of exploitation and have the right to health and social care, and critically, incorporating the CRPD into domestic law will ensure that people can take legal actions if their rights are breached, and matching free legal support with the demand. 4, a comprehensive digital inclusion policy for older and disabled people in the UK. A new government policy to provide free fibre broadband and subsidised IT equipment for all older and disabled people on means-tested benefits. As products and services become digital only. Those who are digitally excluded will become more and more excluded from our society. Free tech skills training and support for those elderly and disabled that are still digitally excluded. As state services and healthcare also transition to digital first models, we as a society cannot forget about those that are still unable to access the digital environment. 5, new employment and entrepreneurship support and valuing disabled people's lives. The government has an ambition for an additional 1 million disabled people into employment by 2027. But with the pandemic, we risk the reverse of this happening in the next year or so. The government needs to invest in more bespoke opportunities, training, and development support. We need to scrap the lower earnings limit for access to work for both this year and next year, and in the first year of any business for all disabled entrepreneurs. New enterprise allowance, a new 2-year transition window where disabled entrepreneurs are guaranteed the same level of income they would receive on state benefits. An end to the misplaced welfare reform policies that have actually cost more than they have saved, whilst also valuing disabled people who cannot work. Following BLM, disabled people's lives matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kush. What a powerful statement and full of gems of policy advice. And again, thank you for all you're doing. And as a driver in Central London, particular thanks. Keep it up. So we have some questions and we welcome more. I'm going to start with one from Alfie Penfold, and that is very relevant to the Moot and to the legal interests of many people around here. And the question is this: can the law and or legal institutions aim to have an impact in redressing the potential inequalities exposed by the pandemic and indeed increased by the pandemic? How would it go about this? So what can the law do? What can legal institutions do to redress some of these inequalities? I'm going to go to Steve first, and then to Jane, and then to Kush.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question, Alfie, as well. It's what I spend the vast majority of my time doing. So I'm pleased to have the chance to talk about how it can be done. We are actually still blessed in this country with a functioning legal system and a legal aid system, which functioning may be putting it slightly too high, but it is still there and it can be used to fund litigation to promote and protect disabled people's rights. And we have a process of judicial review, which I think the efficacy of which can be tested by the fact that the government really doesn't like it and has set up an independent review to look at ways in which perhaps some of the wings of judicial review could be clipped, but that itself is extraordinarily controversial, as some people will know. But it is possible for individual disabled people and organisations to take challenges like the one that was brought against NICE, or at least threatened against NICE, because that was resolved, as many are, at the pre-action stage, to address these problems of discrimination and rights breaches. And when it works, is where there are networks in place, to pick up the theme from several of the talks, that allow disabled people to access specialist lawyers, funding to then flow, and there's a growth, of course, of crowdfunding in this area as well, where legal aid isn't available, and claims to be brought very promptly as they need to be, both in terms of the reality on the ground, but also for reasons of legal procedure. Of course, I'm acutely conscious that the cases that come forward are the tip of a very large pyramid of rights violations that aren't addressed. And for example, the challenge to the absence of any kind of cost protection in the county court when Equality Act claims are brought in relation to providers of goods and services, that failed. So it's still very difficult to enforce the Equality Act against a supermarket or another provider of services that is not making reasonable adjustments or is discriminating in other ways. But certainly in terms of the headline issues of public law that come up, judicial review is still and can still be an effective remedy for disabled people and their organisations to use.
Thank you. Jane, is there things you would add from parliamentary?
Yeah, I would actually. Whilst it's really, really important to have our legal allies and the disabled people in this country are very fortunate that we do have quite a plethora of lawyers who are great allies to disabled people and their rights and often give a lot of pro bono help. It is still very difficult to take a case as an individual disabled person in this country. Not only because legal aid is not as good as it was, and as Steve said, the governments are doing all they can to clip the wings of legal aid, including preventing charities from supporting judicial reviews in the way that they did, and they have the questions about their charitable status if they do. And disabled people's organisations are an incredibly important part of supporting disabled people to feel that they can take a case. We are not a litigious country, as the individual public are not litigious at. So the legal road is always one that is quite daunting for disabled people. So that's why it's so important that we have campaigns out there to support judicial review. So for instance, the Where's the Interpreter campaign, which is about interpreters at the 5 o'clock briefings, that gave enormous support to an individual deaf person to feel that she was able to take the government to court on this through judicial review. And I don't know, Steve, if that's still going on, but certainly it was quite vocal about a month or two ago. So
I believe it is ongoing, Jane, yes.
It is ongoing. I could then wade in from a parliamentary perspective and start asking questions of number 10 and at question time about why this facility was not available. So we're quite lucky that disabled people have people in all parts of society. We have our lawyers, we have our campaigners, and then they've got one or two people like me who are very mouthpiece in the government. And this twin track approach is incredibly important. We can't just rely on disabled people to take cases to lawyers. We can't rely on lawyers to be out there campaigning on behalf of disabled people. It is very much a collective endeavour, and I think that's what's so strong. That is the strength of the disability movement in this country, that we are a collective entity.
Kush, I want to come to you now. You're welcome to comment on that, but I want to get through the questions. We have quite a few of them. And the question I was particularly interested in you answering.
I'm happy to speak on that as well.
By all means. Well, answer that first, and then I'll ask you the next one.
Sure. So legal aid in the UK has been decimated, and we know disability is the strongest predictor of being in poverty. So I would really like to see more law firms provide free pro bono legal advice to disabled people, creating consortiums with UK universities and charities and social enterprises. I think it's really important that we match the supply with the demand in relation to providing legal services for disabled people. I think that will help to address a significant number of human rights violations for disabled people, because currently disabled people cannot enforce their rights due to the financial barriers in actually enforcing their rights. Thanks.
Thank you. That's fantastic. But I'm also going to ask you the next question, just to keep you going. So this question which says, how might we ensure that disabled people are not silent victims in the future?
I believe we all have a duty to speak truth to power. Being a social entrepreneur, I work in many different systems, And one of the things I've noticed from health to tech to, you know, sports, many of the systems that I'm in, there's too many people sitting silently when they have a voice around the table, when there's discrimination happening towards disabled people. Just look at the No Wheelchair Tax campaign. It's shocking that in England, there was such a significant increase in NHS hospitals charging for disabled parking. How was that allowed to happen? Why were people not raising their voice and raising this critical issue when in Scotland they abolished all car parking charges 10 years ago and Wales had done the same a couple of years earlier? Collectively, there's 14 million disabled people in the UK. If we work collectively as a single unit, you know, our purchasing power is 250 billion. Things will change, but we need our allies to also support us and speak truth to power. I feel that sometimes people have their self-interest and they don't want to rock the boat in significant systems like the NHS because they feel that that will risk their own kind of career progression within these systems. We need to have a more compassionate and empathetic approach and be each other's allies going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the list of questions. So what proactive legal steps can be taken to ensure that considerations regarding disabled people are not neglected in another potential crisis? Can I come to you, Steve? What proactive legal steps can be taken to ensure that considerations regarding disabled people are not neglected in another potential crisis?
Can I briefly take the last question as well, Tom?
Yes, yes.
Because I would take great issue with a suggestion that disabled people have been either silent or victims in this pandemic. I think that there's been, I think some disabled people sadly have been victims, and Tom gave us the stats on that. But the disability movement, the disabled people's movement, the organisations that Jane referred to, have been incredibly vocal. Inclusion London's report was incredibly powerful, that was mentioned earlier on. There's been a huge amount of campaigning work that's been done. So I don't think that's a fair characterisation at all. What I think is fair is to say that despite those incredible efforts, spearheaded by people like Jane in Parliament, but with this massive support of the community more widely, it has been, as you said yourself, I think, a huge struggle to keep disabled people's rights front and centre. So it does really come on, I think, to that next question about, well, we are in the second wave and we don't know how bad it's going to be, and hopefully it isn't going to be even as bad as the first wave, but is it going to be worse after Christmas? Who knows? Everything is so unknown. What needs to stop, in my view, is the government retrofitting disabled people's rights to policies after they've been produced. And while, you know, being very generous, there might have been some justification for that in February when the whole place was melting down with, you know, genuine fears about what might happen to the structure of society and the ability of government to function. We're in the second wave now. That excuse, if it was ever there, is completely gone, in my view. And so the answer to that question has to be that you don't need people, you don't want people like me anywhere near it, because I'm only involved when things have gone badly wrong. And just to pick up what Kush is saying, I still do spend most of my day working on legal aid for disabled clients. So although I accept entirely it's challenging to get legal aid, it is still there, and I am kept very busy by legal aid cases. But that's a finger in the dike solution. That's the end of the pipeline. What we want is for government to be listening to the voices of disabled people and their organisations much earlier in the process of policy development. And there's a big question mark, I think, about the role of organisations like the Equality and Human Rights Commission in terms of structurally challenging these issues and getting those issues onto the table at an earlier stage. So short answer is, with as little of my involvement as possible, and much more listening to people like Jane and the people that she's working with in terms of policy influencing.
Jane, I want to come to you now. You heard that question that I asked Kush about how we can ensure that disabled people's voices are heard. there's also another question about this terrible tragedy as an opportunity to mobilize. And so the question is, how can people get involved in this movement, and what needs to be done to get the government to improve their response? So I think both questions are about mobilizing, having your voice heard, and to ensure that the government takes heed of it. So what can we do?
Well, first I would like to agree with Steve. I mean, disabled people are very noisy. We are not wallflowers. We do not sit back and let people treat us like victims. And there is a very powerful voice of disabled people in this country. We have some very strong organisations that have been very vocal, and they helped me enormously over the last 5 months. So, for instance, when I wrote to the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Nursing Officer about the about DNR and issues of disabled people at triage, you know, the able-bodied would go one way and disabled people would go the other. And it certainly wasn't towards any kind of intensive or critical care. So this was addressed very quickly. Disabled people mobilised incredibly well. 160 organisations signed the letter that went straight to Matt Hancock. And as a result of that, he had to make a statement to the effect that all lives mattered, disabled people's lives mattered, and that blanket policies were just simply not acceptable. So I'd just like to say that, you know, disabled people have been incredibly well informed and amongst their communities, and have done a lot to offset some of the darker aspects of this pandemic. So that's just me on my little soapbox. But in terms of our allies are incredibly important. Disabled people have, you know, disability isn't a disabled person's problem. It's the problem of society to get its act in order and to organise differently so that it can be completely inclusive. So allies are an incredibly important part of our movement for change. And, you know, racism isn't a black person's problem. It's a white person's problem. Disability is the same. So together, when we are together, we are much stronger, and we can change. We can change the environment. We can change all this negativity and bad attitudes. And allies are very welcome. They're very welcome within organisations. I mean, you just go online and type in disability campaigning or organisations, and up will come hundreds of organisations. So I would say get informed, find out what we're doing, see what rocks your boat, and join us. That's great. We love allies. But what I would say is that, you know, nothing about us without us. We really do need to give the platform to disabled people to speak out on our own issues. And if you are a good ally and you do not have experience of disability, then support us, facilitate us, come with us, but don't speak on our behalf, because that's been the problem of the past. I think children in need, I've just suffered a whole day of it again. You know, the negativity around the tragic, the brave, the suffering. You know, we must go and raise charity to help these poor creatures have a life. That is not what disabled people want. They want to be included, they want to be leaders, and they want to be out there changing the world and having others listen to us and what we would want. So that's a little note to allies. You're welcome, but don't take over, I think I would say. And what was the other question? I think that's about it, wasn't it?
Well, there's one about getting involved, and you've answered that one. So yeah, I think that's very helpful. I want to ask a question that's come up. Do you think other countries have taken more proactive and successful steps to protect disabled people in a pandemic? And what lessons can we learn from elsewhere? So, Kush, could you help us with this one?
To tell you the truth, I haven't really studied like other countries, but even just if we look at the statistics in the UK compared to Europe, so recently we've had 50,000 deaths. And if the ONS are reporting 3 out of 5, that's 30,000 deaths. So other countries have obviously better protected disabled people. So I think we also do need to learn from that. I think one of the key things in the pandemic, when we were slow into lockdown, even slow into lockdown from the second time, it feels as though that we weren't learning the lessons from the experiences of other countries in relation to the pandemic. And if we do that as a system, then that will also help to protect and save disabled people's lives in the UK. So I think we need to develop a growth mindset from a fixed mindset, developing an aspect of a learn it all rather than thinking we're a know it all. And I think that's really important.
Jane, what can we learn from elsewhere, other countries, do you think?
Well, I can talk about Europe. My European friends, we have a network across Europe, Independent Living Network, we have other networks, and they actually have been saying pretty much what we have, that they've had to fight quite hard to get their significant rights met. I have to say PPE has been a lot better abroad, especially in Sweden, Denmark. PPE was given out to all people, or it was more widely available to people to employ PAs, for instance. Certainly in Sweden that was the case. But figures, I've been looking at all the figures, and we have endless discussions within Parliament about the figures. It's not like for like. People collect their figures differently, different populations, spread of population. So, for instance, in New Zealand, things have been a lot better for disabled people, but people are spread up a lot more. And again, disabled people have pretty much stayed at home in these countries. I don't think we're at a place yet where we can actually compare countries in the way that we would like to, because connecting figures, the socioeconomic situations are very different. So I wouldn't like to say that we've fared worse or better, but certainly in the Netherlands, things have been a lot better, and Scandinavia.
Steve, would you add to that?
Nothing particularly to add. That's on my narrow focus is on England and Wales, really, as a lawyer here. So nothing useful to contribute on what's going on more widely.
I made a face there, Jane, because if you were living in a care home in Sweden, you were not protected, and
no, yes.
you died in droves. So it's a bit of a mix. I think the evidence is that you should either live on an island, like New Zealand, perhaps, or you should live under an authoritarian regime, which is anti-democratic and force people to be quarantined. Countries like Rwanda and China and some of the Southeast Asian countries have been very effective, but at the cost of people's human rights, because they've confined people and so forth. So it's a complicated story, as Jane says. It's very difficult to compare. I wanted to ask about some of the pluses, which sounds odd, but there have been pluses. Jane talked about the way that people have organised. There's this wonderful online institution called the Staying In. We all are on Zoom now, and that overcomes some of our barriers, enables some disabled people to participate who couldn't otherwise participate. One of the things that's changed is that many trials have had to move online. And the question is, do you think this should continue in the future to allow greater accessibility for disabled people? So I'm afraid I'm going to come to you, Steve, as our resident barrister. Is it helpful to disabled people when trials are online?
Yes, as an option has to be the answer. And again, as with any question like that, the answer is it depends, doesn't it, on the person's impairments, but more importantly on the ways in which our environment is specifically inaccessible for them and the ways in which we are responsible for them being disabled. So for some people, the ability to communicate remotely like this is a massive benefit. For others, it's completely inaccessible. And so, as always with the pandemic, I'm afraid there have been winners and losers. And it has meant that for some, there has been effectively no effective access to justice for the last 9 months and continuing. For others, I'm thinking of clients, for example, who've been clients on the autistic spectrum, and have told me that it's a much easier way for them to communicate with me and a much easier way for them to give their evidence to the court. So, but again, that's also a cliche because that's not a universal truth either. That's a particular experience for some people on the spectrum. So my concern, I suppose, is that it's one of those things that could be seized upon as a cost-cutting measure, but with a fig leaf of, oh, it's better for people. And I think the reality is that it will only be better for people if it's a choice. And choices tend to cost more because you might have to have a court that's available and the remote facility, and then see what the person themselves finds most accessible. So it's been exciting, actually, in many ways, learning that we can do law like this, and we can offer at least something close to effective justice in many cases like this. But it's not a cure-all, it's not a panacea at all. And my worry is that in a context of austerity and cuts, it will become a default option for some cases, which will put some people at a huge disadvantage.
Jane or Kush, can you, that was a question about trials, but we could look at it more broadly. Can you see benefits, perhaps to going online or perhaps to other changes that we've had as a result of the pandemic?
I think it's both, it swings and roundabouts. For some, it's been brilliant. You know, they've had direct access to their work, they've been able to work at home, continue to work and not have to be furloughed. For others, it's been incredibly isolating, and what quite a few disabled people are worried about is that when it's time to go back to work, their employers will say, well, you can stay at home now. It's cheaper for us to have you at home. We don't need to provide you with all the reasonable adaptations and accommodations because you can stay at home. So it's the jury is out on it. I think that's what I would say. There's some incredible gains, but there may be some losses. I think we'll just have to watch and see. In terms of trials and connecting with the judicial system and access to justice, again, good and bad. I've heard people really struggling with having their cases heard virtually. There's a young woman with mental health issues who is currently in prison, and she was told that she had to do everything virtually, and it caused her great distress. She didn't know how to behave, and as a result, her time in prison is going to be extended. So it's both, I think.
Kush, anything to add?
So disabled people have been asking for reasonable adjustments to work from home for ages, and we were always told it's not possible, you can't do that. And in the stroke of, a few days of the pandemic, suddenly everybody was working from home, and suddenly it's reasonable for everybody. So in that aspect, I think it shone a light on the hypocrisy in the system sometimes. And I think in some ironic way, by shining a light on the inequalities, we can start to address the inequalities. So from September, the web accessibility regulations came into play for public sector organizations. And I'm still, from the statistics that I've seen, lots of public sector organizations are still not accessible. And that's a real concern if you're looking at courts and, say, NHS facilities. The other key concern I also have are disabled people who are digitally excluded. So I'll give you an example. Recently, I care for my mum and dad. Elderly people are now being discouraged to come into hospital due to them contracting the virus for appointments that are not critical. So when my mum had a physiotherapy appointment, they set up a Zoom call. My mum's never used the internet before. So I set up the internet for her, but then I asked the physiotherapist, what would happen if I wasn't here and my mum couldn't use Zoom? She said, then she'll have a telephone call. How can you assess a physiotherapy appointment appropriately on the telephone? It's ridiculous. So then I raised the issue with my trust and I said, you know, it's not sufficient for NHS organizations just to go digital. They also have to look at the people that are digitally excluded, the elderly and the disabled, and help them to get online and make the digital environment accessible. And we're starting to do that. But my concern as a system is that must be happening in, you know, all parts of our country. So we need a collective kind of aspect with the government to actually focus on digital exclusion, especially in the time of a pandemic, where more and more services are going online.
Thank you. And I think your point is very well made about the people who didn't have internet access, who didn't have laptops, who didn't have iPads. One of the things that's been a real problem has been about children and in terms of education. And a lot of education has gone online before, obviously, the schools were opened up again. And that was great, except for kids with special education needs and disabilities who often didn't have their needs met, and particularly young people whose families didn't have internet access, didn't have computers at home. And that's a very significant minority who were totally excluded from education for that period when the schools were closed. There's a question here. We're coming up to the end, so if you have any questions, please send them and we'll try and answer them. But this is about building back better, if you like. Why has the government been so reticent at working with disabled people to produce a disability-inclusive response and recovery plan to COVID-19? So why have they not worked with disabled people? So I'm going to go to Jane with that question first.
Well, how do I answer this without being too political? We have a government that are not very good at being collaborative with any group at the moment, not just disabled people, I would say. There are issues, very similar issues actually, in terms of their response on a whole range of equality measures. Equality and human rights does not sit comfortably with a Conservative government, and especially this particular one. And they're not being very collaborative with anybody. I can tell you from somebody who works within the House of Lords, holding government to account at the moment is very challenging. And they are not so collaborative in their style. Collaborative government seems to have dwindled quite a lot over the last few years. So I would say that we have a particularly challenging government when it comes to collective or collegiate responses. So that's in terms of kind of political culture that we're working within. Also, we have a government that are particularly keen for community or charity to respond to the needs of disabled people. It's quite, they've been quite traditional in many sense of the word, really. So again, I found that particularly challenging as a disabled person working within the House of Lords in the last few years. And disability has, frankly, fallen off the agenda because we do not now have a very active Disability Rights Commission pushing this agenda from the centre. I mean, the DRC for 10 years did some amazing work and really, really pushed the disability agenda hard. Without a very well-funded commission, it's a lot harder for disparate disability organisations to do that. So, yeah, it's tough. And the only way we can go forward is by continuing doing what we're doing as coming together, you know, with one voice. I keep saying this, but, you know, don't work in your little organisations. Come together and speak with one voice. Because, hey, it's the 25th anniversary of the Disability Discrimination Act. and we should be celebrating the mighty force of disabled people when they come together with one voice and campaign for something. We normally get what we want. So maybe it's time to relook at that.
Thank you very much, Jane. I was going to ask the other two to answer that question, but not only have we got to wind up, but you answered so brilliantly and beautifully. I don't think there's anything left to say, except to thank you, to thank Kush, to thank Steve for the work you're doing and for the way you answer those questions to all of our benefit. I'm going to pass over to Bryony now, who's going to say a few words. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. I can't get my video to work, but I'm Bryony and I have, thank you. I'm Bryony and I have been the person sort of putting together the panel and contacting all the panelists. And I just want to say a massive thank you to Tom for chairing that so expertly, and for our panelists who have given some really powerful comments, and hopefully they are able to come away, the audience are able to come away from this panel discussion with a lot to take out of it. I definitely have. And it's really nice to have seen that while we were highlighting the tragedy of how COVID has impacted people with disabilities, also the immense power in the disabled community and people really coming together to use their voices to make change. So I just want to give a final thank you to you all. It's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for sort of coming and speaking.
And I just want to say thank you on behalf of the organising committee to the Mooters, judges, panellists and attendees for participating in this first online Herbert Smith Free Hills Disability Mooting Championship. I also just wanted to say something very briefly about why this event was set up in the first place. And I think the panel discussion that we've heard today has really highlighted what lies behind this event and the work we do as part of the Oxford University Disability Law and Policy Project. And that really is to provide young lawyers who are on our law courses the critical skills so that whether they identify as having a disability themselves or are able to be an ally within the profession, that they have the critical skills to better understand the law as it intersects with disability and the way it affects the lives of disabled people. And as all of the speakers indicated today, we need more people with disabilities in positions of power and in public representation, and that includes throughout the legal profession. And throughout government and parliament. And so thank you to all those who have taken part, and there will be a recording of this event online available in the coming weeks. We will make sure that's shared with you, and do enjoy the rest of the evening. I'm sad that this year we won't be able to celebrate with you, but you're all in our thoughts, and thanks so much for taking part.